We reported it just recently on Visualeconomik. On Friday, 10th of October, yet another storm broke out between the United States and China. It was the 8th time that the Trump administration announced a major change in tariffs designed to punish the Asian giant. On top of that, Trump added new export controls for key technologies. And all because, this time, there was a very clear and rather ironic casus belli. China has tightened controls on rare earth exports. And why do we say ironic? Because Trump uses tariffs intensively, precisely, to prevent Chinese products from crossing US borders. And just now, when Xi Jinping can make it much harder for certain Chinese products to enter the US, Trump gets angry. Be that as it may, it seems that things are finally starting to calm down. On Visualeconomik, we already told you that this is basically a tug of war, a real power struggle for political influence. And we also told you how, even if this storm passes, the clash between Washington and Beijing isn't going away anytime soon. In any case, this whole story has brought up some important questions. Why has China limited rare earth exports? How might this affect the rest of the global economy? To what extent does Beijing have a weapon in its hands? Should we be concerned? Well, that's exactly what we're going to look at next. So, let's get started. China controls rare earths, a critical component in high-tech products, including the most advanced missiles and combat vehicles. It's a national security priority. And the issue is that it doesn't just control mining, as many people believe, because after all, rare earths are not exactly rare or difficult to mine, although the process is quite polluting. No, the real problem with these metals arises when it comes to refining them. This is a very expensive process that only China, with its enormous economies of scale, lax environmental regulations, public bank loans, and an army of highly specialized engineers can control. And now, China wants to put some brakes on this, which could mean that it will no longer share these refined rare earths. These are the export controls announced by the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. But not only that, they've also talked about banning the export of other more complex products that have been manufactured with these materials, even if they only contain 1% of Chinese rare earths. Do you understand now why Trump suddenly got so angry? But the story doesn't end here. Xi Jinping doesn't want the US to do its own refining, or at least he doesn't want to make it easy. So he's also banned the export of capital, physical capital, such as machinery, and also human capital. Yes, you heard me correctly, human capital too. The Chinese government is revoking the passports of some scientists and engineers, so that their professional secrets remain within China. This is a sign that the Asian giant is taking its plans very seriously. And no wonder, because although this is a tug of war, Beijing knows it can only negotiate from a position of strength. That's the best way to bend Mr. Trump to its will. In fact, the US president has already declared a trade war with tariffs of 145%, and he lost. He was forced to reach an agreement in which China gave up practically nothing. The reason is easy to explain. The two countries depend on each other, but it's quite likely that, when it comes down to it, the US depends on China more than China depends on the US. And on top of that, the Asian giant has spent decades preparing for American trade offensives, expanding its markets all across Southeast Asia, to the point that practically everything it stopped exporting to the US ended up in countries such as Vietnam and Malaysia. However, as we already told you on Visualeconomik, this does not mean that China is interested in a trade war. Not at all. In fact, after Trump announced the new round of tariffs, the Chinese authorities came out to say that the Americans had misunderstood them, that they didn't want to start a war.
China's export controls are not export bans. Licenses will be granted for eligible applications. All applications of compliant export for civil use can get approval, so that relevant businesses have no need to worry.
Now, technically, this is not true. But of course, where there's a law, there's a loophole. Trump has imposed tariffs on Canadian children's stories for national security reasons, so China can come up with any excuse it wants to ban these exports whenever the government deems it necessary. And no, the story thing is not an exaggeration, nor did we make it up. It's 100% real. But then, why does it seem like everyone is backing down, including the Chinese themselves? Didn't we just say that China has the upper hand? Well, not yet. Or at least not entirely. There are a couple of absolutely crucial areas where Uncle Sam can still exert pressure: software and semiconductors. Even so, we don't know if that advantage will last long. Over the last decade, Chinese companies have surprised the world by rising to the top of sectors that had previously eluded them. The most striking case is automobiles, with Build Your Dreams, BYD, leading the way. Let's face it, did you know of any Chinese vehicle companies before the electric boom? I'm guessing you didn't. But while the old Western manufacturers have struggled to make the leap to electric, the Chinese have been remarkably efficient. Yet there's one sector that still eludes the Asian giant. Microchips, the same ones used to train artificial intelligence but which are key in all industrial sectors. And yes, they're also crucial to military muscle. So it will come as no surprise to learn that banning the export of the most advanced chips and machines that manufacture them was one of Joe Biden's first measures. The goal, well, it's crystal clear: to prevent China from developing state-of-the-art artificial intelligence that would put the country at the forefront of the race. And believe me, Xi Jinping did not like these controls at all.
Export controls have been effective in constraining and limiting Chinese chip production capabilities. Huawei production of Ascend would grow from 805,000 this year to 1,175,000 in 2025. More importantly, production next year would grow from 300,000 to over 5 million Ascend 910C.
It will come as no surprise that when China threatened to cut off rare earth exports to the West, lifting these sanctions was one of its main demands. That said, in the end, China backed down and didn't impose overly strict export controls, neither on rare earths nor on batteries, even though the US still didn't allow its most advanced chips to be sold to China. Now, whether you think that trying to stifle China's computing capacity is a good or bad thing, one thing was clear: the controls were working, at least for the objectives set by the White House, which has made this news much harder to understand.
NVIDIA, AMD to resume AI chip sales to China in U.S. reversal. U.S. government officials told NVIDIA they would greenlight export licenses for its H20 artificial intelligence accelerator.
Yes, you heard correctly. Donald Trump authorized the sale to China of one of the most advanced chips on the planet. In exchange for what? Well, that's what everyone is wondering, because on the other side, Beijing conceded practically nothing. In fact, the most striking aspect of the agreement was that NVIDIA and AMD, and not China, would pay 15% of exports to the US government, in what is a kind of tax on foreign sales that many believe to be completely illegal, even though the White House has forced these companies to present these payments as an agreement of mutual interest. Whatever the case, Trump did say that the most advanced chips of all will still be banned. However, he left the door open for negotiation in exchange for more money.
The Blackwell is super duper advanced. I wouldn't make a deal with that. Although it's possible I'd make a deal on a somewhat enhanced in a negative way Blackwell. In other words, take 30% to 50% off of it, but that's the latest and the greatest in the world. Nobody has it. They won't have it for 5 years.
And here comes the best part. When Washington finally gives the green light for China to buy reasonably cutting-edge technology, Xi Jinping goes and bans it at home. Yes, just like that. The Chinese government has categorically ordered giants such as Tencent, Alibaba, and ByteDance, the company behind TikTok, to stop using Nvidia's H20 chips and cards, such as the RTX 6000D. We're talking about decaffeinated versions of other Nvidia models. Chips with limited capabilities so they can be exported to China, although naturally these models were also under US controls. And now China is doing the same thing by sending decaffeinated batteries to the US. But then the obvious question arises: why is Beijing going from demanding an end to export controls to banning those very chips itself? The answer is simple. The Communist Party believes that the local industry is now ready to stand on its own 2 feet. So, Xi, following Trump's example, has imposed a tariff, only in an infinite percent version. Now, are Chinese chips advanced enough to make that leap? The answer is yes, but no. The processors made by Huawei and company are still a long way from competing with the best in the world, but they do have an ace up their sleeve: ridiculously low energy consumption. Imagine this: your chips are half as powerful. Yes, but they use half the electricity. The solution? Well, you put 2 in and voila! You make it work. Now, before some of you jump down my throat, obviously it's much more complex than that, but I think you get the idea. And remember that hardware isn't everything. Nvidia's real defensive wall is called CUDA, the software that orchestrates its chips and squeezes every last bit of power out of them. Well, in China, engineers are working flat out on 2 fronts: designing chips that are 100% compatible with CUDA, because that's the language the whole industry speaks, and developing software optimizations to compensate for hardware shortcomings. Have you heard of DeepSeek? the Chinese ChatGPT, it works surprisingly well, despite being trained with second-rate graphics. Although many believe they told a little white lie and did use some state-of-the-art graphics cards. In any case, it appears to be much more efficient. Its trick, much more refined code. And the same goes for chips. Less physical muscle in exchange for more digital brainpower.
Huawei plans to open source its Unified Cache Manager, UCM, reducing latency by up to 90% and improving system throughput by up to 22 times. This would significantly blunt the impact of HBM restrictions on sanctioned entities, which experts agree is a critical bottleneck for domestic accelerators.
Visualeconomik community, here we see another huge difference between China and the United States, and this one will probably surprise you. Chinese companies have no qualms about sharing their software with the rest of the world, including their US competitors. Are they charitable? Not at all. This is part of a perfectly designed plan by Beijing. Release the code, get half the planet to use it, and in the process, make it work better with Chinese hardware than with any other. The result is obvious. You encourage domestic production and make life difficult for your rivals. It's exactly the same argument Mark Zuckerberg gave to justify Meta's commitment to open source. Much more so than other companies, like OpenAI, which is only open in name. But it doesn't end there. So far we've talked about chips, but another fundamental technology is the machines that manufacture them, or even the machines that make the machines that manufacture them. And in this, the absolute reigning champion is the Dutch company ASML, with an almost total monopoly. Well, in response, China has launched a full-scale offensive to build its own lithography industry. It has plenty of reasons to be cautious. A few days after Trump announced his new 100% tariffs, we read news stories like this.
Dutch government takes control of China-owned chip firm. In the UK, Nexperia was forced to sell its silicon chip plant in Newport after MPs and ministers expressed national security concerns.
How far can they go? Estimates say that, if all goes well, the Communist Party will achieve independence in producing 5-nanometer chips. Sounds good, but take note. They would still be light years away from the 2-nanometer chips already being produced by TSMC in Taiwan. In summary, China is playing a game of tug of war. On the one hand, it's being very aggressive in seeking to make its microchip supply chain independent, but on the other hand, it knows that this is a vulnerability and doesn't want to take too many risks. It's one thing for the US to only let them play around with somewhat watered down graphics cards, but if Trump follows through on his threat and bans them from using software such as Nvidia's CUDA, the situation could become critical for Xi Jinping's government. And I know what many of you are thinking. Well, it's true that the US has the microchip ace up its sleeve, but China dominates rare earths. Surely that will allow it to blackmail Trump and get its way. Well, yes, but no. It's true that China controls more than 90% of the refining of many critical materials, but this advantage is not as great as it seems. In fact, this is not the first time that the Asian giant has made a similar move. Back in 2010, it already applied a control of this kind in retaliation against Japan for political issues. To give you an idea, the price of some rare earths increased 45-fold. Yes, you heard correctly, 45-fold. And China did not lift these controls until 2015, 4 years later. Now let me ask you a question. Does anyone remember the terrible rare earth crisis of 2010? No need to answer because I already know the answer. No, none of you remember because that crisis never happened. China thought it had the upper hand, but the rest of the world did not sit idly by. On the screen you can see references to rare earths in the earnings calls of Western companies. The pattern is clear. When China banned exports of these materials, companies began discussing how to increase production or innovate to replace them with others that did not depend on China. And as we often say around here, no sooner said than done. Patents from companies related to these materials skyrocketed, especially in the production of permanent magnets, which is one of the main applications of rare earths. In a very short time, companies found more efficient ways to manufacture magnets without using so many rare earths, or they simply found alternatives to these magnets. And the mechanism is very clear. Prices are indicators. If prices rise in a sector, then investing there becomes much more profitable. More investment, more supply, and the price returns to normal, or even drops a little further. Just as the semiconductor controls imposed by the US on China are encouraging Chinese companies to make their own advances, Western companies are not standing still when the Chinese bully them. This chart sums it all up. In red, you can see the consequences of China's policy if companies did not adapt, and in blue, you can see the actual damage. from half a percentage point of GDP to 0.05%, 10 times less damage. And let's face it, the money that was invested in rare earths could have been invested in other sectors, which would have been better for everyone. But it doesn't matter, because even so, the impact of these controls on Western GDP was ridiculously small. It's true that the West greatly underestimates China, but the Asian giant has made the same mistake more times than it usually admits. To conclude, both blocs have reasons not to escalate the trade war too much. It's clear that we'll continue to see many moves like those of recent days, but it's most likely that no country will implement overly radical policies. So as we already told you on Visualeconomik, you can sleep easy tonight knowing that no, it's not the end of the world. Of course it would be better if everyone cooperated, but there's no need to panic. Be that as it may, now it's your turn. Do you think the trade war between China and the US will escalate? Or will we see one side back down? If China maintains a very radical position on rare earths, will we see Western companies adapt as they have done in the past decade? You can leave me your answers down in the comments, and don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, and if you like the video, give it a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, see you next time.